Turn your head in Bristol and you're bound to see a name posted almost anywhere. Why do we see these names all around us? Who were they? What did they do? Why are they important? What's in a name?
For the next few episodes of What's in a Name, we will be looking at some of the more unusual names of areas in and around our city. In this episode, we take a look at Rooster Hill, Big Hell, and Little Hell. Most people know that Bristol was named after the English industrial port city of Bristol, England. But there are several areas in and around Bristol that have some very strange names. We talked to Bristol's historian Bud Phillips about the origination of some of those names.
Rooster Hill was one of the names of 3 or 4 different names that was put on the highest point of the East Hill Cemetery. It's kind of a knob rising up above Beaver Creek Valley here. And the oldest name I could find for it on old records was called Maryland Hill. And that because General Shelby became a slightly diminished in his old days, and he was native of Maryland, and he'd run off from home or get away from home and go up to that hill and wouldn't come down. They'd have about dark, they'd go up to see if they could find him, and he'd be sitting up there on a log, and he would resist coming back down because he'd say, "I'm home in Maryland, I'm going to stay." But that it had originally been called Round Hill before that, and then later it went back to the name Round Hill, and then finally on down to another name or two, and of course it's just East Hill now. Well, Rooster Hill was the next name after it was called Round. Had gone back to Round Hill. It was because a man here named Sykes, or his first name slips me right now. But he was kind of a roguish type man, moved here to Bristol real early. And he found out that people liked some of the rougher element of town liked rooster fighting. And so he began to have rooster fights up there in the woods. It's just covered with woods then. And he'd take game roosters up there, and they bet on them and everything else, of course. So people dubbed it as Rooster Hill. And then, strangely, when the cemetery began to be started up there, when it started, it went back to Round Hill again. And they said that was a little more dignified name for a cemetery than just to call it Rooster Hill. They didn't want that at all. It gradually went back to Round Hill Cemetery. It's what the old East Hill Cemetery was known as Round Hill. And so remained until probably the 1890s. And people got to simply saying the cemetery on the hill east of town. And that's the way it became East Hill. But yes, Rooster Hill was one of the names it had at one time. We had 2 places in town that had names that used the word hell in it. Big Hell Bottom was the area around the present Bristol, Virginia courthouse. There was a street there known as Water Street, and Water Street was lined with brothels and gambling halls and all sorts of things that the more righteous of the town hated, but some way or another they cut to calling it the Big Hell Bottom. And it so was named until late in the 1800s. It gradually lost the identity of that. But then there was another Little Hell, they call it. That was the end of 2nd Street, off the end of 2nd Street. That was still pretty much called that when I came here 61 years ago. And it became part of my territory to work when I was in the welfare work here. A lot of people were rough and tough, but they were also poor, most of them. And I had to go in the Little Hell to do my work, visit my clients and so on. And I had a real unusual experience there, but I can't go into the details now because some of it wouldn't be permissible on the air, I don't think. But in my work there, I got into some strange situations. It was said, and it might be true, that there was more hell in Little Hell than there was in Big Hell, but that's just what the old-timers would joke about it when I came here. They'd say, well, yeah, that's the end of 2nd Street down there is called Little Hell, but they said there's more there than there is in Big Hill. Of course, Big Hill had about faded out by the time I got here. It's still a rough area over in there, but seldom did anybody call it that at that time, but it had been well known as that. The area of State Street, East State Street, from Pennsylvania Avenue to the railroad, when I came here, that was business in there. There's one store, one business after another on the Tennessee side. Now, on the Virginia side, the big old First Baptist Church took most of that block. And then there was a business service station in the next part of it. But on the Tennessee side, it was virtually all solid business from Pennsylvania Avenue to the railroad. All that's been torn out now. I think there was one vacant lot between the railroad and Pennsylvania Avenue. And it was used for a taxi stand, as I remember, the Bluebird Taxi Company, I believe. Anyway, it was a place, for some reason, the alcoholics and the street people and ne'er-do-wells and so on would gather there. It was just lined up and down the street there. Some of them would sit on the sidewalk. Some of them would get over on the steps of the First Baptist Church, especially in winter when it was cold. They'd get over there and sit in the sun. One day, a man just leaned back against the steps and died over there. I remember that exciting time real well, but you could hardly get through there. Most of them were harmless as far as that's concerned, but you could hardly get through there without it being bummed for a quarter or whatever change you might have. And their standard statement was that they wanted a quarter to get a bowl of beans. Well, off Pennington's Cafe up there, you could get not only a bowl of beans, but you get a big hunk of cornbread for a quarter. Well, that's what they'd use as an excuse. They'd say, I want a quarter, I'm hungry, I want a quarter for a bowl of beans. One time, I was going through there, and I knew it'd happen. I knew that I'd be bummed before I got through there, and sure enough, a man stepped out on the sidewalk or out from the front of the building where he's sitting in a window in the front of the building. And he said, I need a quarter for a bowl of beer, he said. He made a Freudian slip there, I guess. That's really what he wanted the quarter for, was to get some beer. But he made the slip. He forgot to say beans, said, I want a quarter for a bowl of beer. Well, of course, I knew that to begin with. I knew why he wanted it. But it went on for years. Some of those alcoholics out behind the buildings, you could find numerous bottles of shoe polish. You get liquid shoe polish in those days. What they did, they strained the alcohol out of it. They wanted the alcohol, and they thought that if they strained it through a dirty sock, it wouldn't be dangerous. And there's old piles of socks back there with piles of bottles behind those buildings where they had done that. I hope no one in town's that desperate now, but they were that desperate back then.
If you ever wondered about the origins of the name of a particular area in or around Bristol, drop us an email at jdunham@bristoltn.org. We might not be able to answer your question, but we will do our best.